When a royal guard was sent to inspect Queen Camilla's private wardrobe inside Clarence's house, no one expected what he would find. Hidden behind rows of emerald gowns and ceremonial coats lay a garment that carried the scent of time itself, the late Queen Elizabeth II's original coronation robe, a symbol of duty, history, and heartbreak, long believed to be sealed away forever. But why was it there? And who had placed it, silently, in Camilla's closet? This quiet discovery would open an emotional chapter the world thought had closed the day the Queen took her final bow. What the royal staff uncovered next left even Buckingham Palace speechless. If royal mysteries and emotional true-life moments like this captivate you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. It helps us bring you more powerful, untold royal stories that deserve to be remembered. And share this one with someone who still believes that the past never truly disappears inside the palace walls. It was a quiet, rain-washed morning at Clarence's house, the kind of morning where even the walls seemed to listen, where footsteps echoed softer than usual, and the staff spoke in lowered tones. The king had left for an early meeting, and Queen Camilla had requested a full audit of her ceremonial wardrobe before an upcoming royal event. Among the team of attendants and housekeepers stood Sergeant Thomas Elroy, a senior member of the Royal Guard. He'd been serving the crown for nearly 25 years, long enough to know that every uniform, every garment, and every trinket in those rooms told a story. But that morning, he was about to discover one that no one had expected. He reached for the last oak wardrobe in the dressing room, an older cabinet, one rarely opened since Queen Elizabeth's passing. The hinges creaked softly as he turned the golden handle. Inside hung rows of gowns, silk coats, and evening dresses, perfectly pressed, untouched by time. But as Thomas began to note each item on his clipboard, his hand stopped. At the back of the closet, wrapped in a thick layer of royal blue linen, was something heavy, something old. He frowned. "What's this doing here?" he muttered half to himself. Carefully, he reached in and drew the bundle into the light. The room seemed to hold its breath. As the fabric unfurled, a deep scarlet velvet shimmered beneath the dim bulbs, the color so vivid, so unmistakable, it made his heart stutter. The Queen's coronation robe, the very same robe that had swept across Westminster Abbey on June 2, 1953, trailing behind a young monarch as she pledged her life to service before God and empire. Every inch of it, from the hand-stitched gold thread to the intricate embroidered emblems of the Commonwealth, was intact. Thomas froze. His fingers hovered, trembling slightly. "No, it can't be," he whispered. He'd seen photographs of it in history books, even guarded exhibitions where replicas were displayed. But this wasn't a replica. The weight, the scent of the old velvet, the faint perfume that clung to it. It was real. He turned to Lady Margaret, the wardrobe curator who had followed him silently into the room. Her eyes widened as she gasped softly, covering her mouth. That's impossible," she murmured. The original coronation robe was placed in storage at Windsor decades ago. But there it was, shimmering under the dull light of Camilla's dressing room. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence carried the weight of something sacred, like a whisper from the past had drifted through the room. Thomas carefully laid the robe across a chair, his gloves brushing the embroidery of the Commonwealth flowers, the English rose, the Scottish thistle, the Irish shamrock, and the Canadian maple leaf. He felt the history pulsing through every stitch. And then came the question that neither wanted to voice. How did it end up here? Within an hour, quiet ripples spread through Clarence's house. The head chamberlain was called. The curator of royal textiles was summoned from Windsor. Even the palace archivist arrived discreetly, escorted through the back corridor to avoid press attention.
The discovery was treated with near-religious care. The robe was moved into the central hall, placed under soft light for inspection. One by one, experts leaned in, historians, conservators, and tailors, their faces registering the same mix of awe and confusion. "This is the authentic coronation garment," one whispered. "The gold threadwork, the pattern of the Tudor rose, there's no doubt." But the mystery deepened when they found something else. Inside the folded silk lining, stitched so discreetly it was almost invisible, was a small handwritten note. The ink had faded, but the writing was unmistakably elegant, a royal hand. It read, "For safekeeping, let this remain where the heart feels most at home. E.R. Elizabeth Regina." There was no date, no context, just those few words, enough to send chills through every person present. Lady Margaret stood still for several seconds, tears quietly pooling in her eyes. She must have moved it herself, she whispered, before she passed. Thomas swallowed hard. But why? Hey, in Her Majesty Camilla's closet. No one could answer. Hours later, when Queen Camilla returned from an engagement, she found the entire corridor uncharacteristically silent. The staff stood lined along the hallway, a strange, reverent quietness surrounding them. Her assistant approached gently. "There's something you need to see." When Camilla entered the dressing room, her eyes fell instantly on the scarlet velvet laid across the chair. For a brief moment, she froze, the air catching in her throat. Then she stepped closer, her hand hovering over the familiar texture. She didn't speak at first, only silence, the kind that fills a room when emotions run deeper than words. "I never thought I'd see this again," she said softly. "Not in this house." Her fingers brushed the gold thread, tracing the emblem of the rose. "She wore this the day she began her reign," she murmured. "And now it's found its way here." A pause, almost as if she could feel the late queen's presence in the room. Gentle, silent, forgiving. "It's strange," Camilla said quietly, turning to Thomas. "She once told me, years ago, the robes we wear don't crown us. It's how we carry their weight that matters." Her voice trembled ever so slightly. For all the rumors, the comparisons, the headlines that had once shadowed her name, at that moment, it was just two queens connected through one symbol of history, a robe, and the unspoken grace of time. As the robe was carefully covered and moved for preservation, the palace corridors whispered again. The news hadn't reached the public yet. Not even the press office knew the full story. But those who witnessed it that day spoke later, quietly, of how the atmosphere in Clarence House changed. It was as if the spirit of Elizabeth lingered for a brief, shimmering moment, watching over her successor, leaving behind one final message of peace. And deep down, many believed this was not just an accident, but a farewell gift, a silent gesture from the late queen, reminding the new one that the robe, like the crown, was never truly about power. It was about continuity, about carrying the story forward. The next morning, Clarence House looked calm from the outside, but behind the walls, something extraordinary was unfolding. Specialists from the royal collection had arrived before dawn. Their task, to examine the robe and confirm what everyone now quietly suspected, that this was not just a preserved relic, it was the original coronation robe of Queen Elizabeth II. They worked in near silence, the air filled with reverence. Every movement was careful, almost ceremonial. Cotton gloves brushed over gold threadwork that hadn't seen light in 70 years. The faint scent of lavender and cedar lingered, just as it had in the late Queen's day. Camilla watched from a few steps away, her expression steady but soft. To her, this was not merely fabric. It was a story, one sewn into the seams of the monarchy itself. A curator named Dr. Penelope Shaw, an expert in royal textiles, leaned close to inspect a particular section. "There's something unusual here," she murmured. With a magnifier, she studied the inner embroidery, where the symbols of the Commonwealth were stitched. Her brow furrowed. There are initials, very small. They weren't documented in the archives. The initials read simply, E and P. Camilla tilted her head. "E and P," she repeated. Dr. Shaw nodded. "Elizabeth and Philip." Hidden under the lining, as if the robe was more than a crown piece. It was personal. The Queen's eyes glistened faintly. For all the grandeur of the coronation, for all the pomp the world had seen that day in 1953, this tiny mark reminded everyone that beneath the crown was a woman who loved her husband deeply and who'd quietly left a trace of him near her heart even as she ascended alone. Philip was always by her side, Camilla said softly, even when the world watched her walk that long aisle. Her words hung in the air. As the morning went on, the staff discovered something else, an embroidered lily, slightly off-center, on the lower edge of the robe. It wasn't part of the official design. The royal archives showed no mention of it. Could it be a restitch? Thomas asked. Dr. Shaw shook her head. No, it's intentional. The thread is identical to the original, which means it was done before the coronation, possibly by the Queen herself. That revelation sent a ripple of quiet all through the room. Camilla leaned in closer. A lily, for renewal, she murmured. She must have added it privately, as a symbol of her faith. The discovery transformed the robe from a historical artifact into something almost sacred. Each stitch became a whisper from the past, each thread a memory brought back to life. And soon, that whisper began to echo far beyond Clarence House. That afternoon, word reached Buckingham Palace, discreetly, through official channels. His Majesty King Charles was informed of the find while meeting foreign dignitaries. The aide who delivered the message said the king went silent for nearly a full minute, his expression unreadable. Then, he quietly excused himself from the room. Hours later, his car arrived at Clarence House. Camilla was still seated in the wardrobe chamber when he entered, the robe displayed gently across a long table. The light from the windows poured in, casting the gold thread in a soft glow. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Charles stepped closer, his eyes tracing the velvet folds with quiet recognition. I remember the day she wore this, he said, almost to himself. I was just 4 years old. I thought she looked like a goddess. Camilla turned to him. It's strange how things find their way back. He nodded, his gaze distant. It's not strange, he said softly. She always believed that things with meaning come home when they are needed most. The words hung heavy between them. For Charles, the robe wasn't just a piece of history. It was a reminder of his mother's promise, her endurance, her life of sacrifice. And now, in his reign, it had reappeared, as though her blessings still lingered in the folds. He reached out, his fingers brushing the embroidered lily. She used to say this flower was a symbol of resurrection, he murmured, of what lives on. Later that evening, as twilight settled over London, the couple sat together in quiet reflection. The robe had been moved to a preservation chamber for temporary safekeeping, but its presence still filled the house. Camilla finally spoke. It feels like she's telling us something, not just about legacy, but about grace. Charles looked at her with a faint, tired smile. Perhaps, he said, she's reminding us that every crown passes through human hands, not perfect ones, but willing ones. The comment struck a deep chord. For Camilla, who had spent years under public scrutiny, those words felt almost like absolution. Maybe, in some way, this rediscovered robe wasn't just a message from the past. It was a bridge between two queens who had once walked different roads, now meeting at the same point of understanding. The following morning, the royal press office was alerted, but under strict instruction from the king, no public statement was to be made yet. Let the story breathe, he said. It's not for spectacle. It's for remembrance. Still, whispers began to spread. Within hours, royal watchers online started noticing unconfirmed reports of a significant royal textile discovery. Speculation ran wild. Some thought it was a tiara. Others guessed it was one of Queen Victoria's gowns. None came close to the truth. But inside Clarence House, the robe's rediscovery brought a quiet sense of peace. Staff who had worked under both monarchs said they felt something different in the air. Calmer, lighter. As one housekeeper said later, it was as if the late queen had finally passed her spirit to the new one, not with ceremony, but with kindness. That night, as Camilla walked alone through the halls, she paused by the room where the robe was being stored. The door was slightly ajar. She stepped inside and looked at it under the soft preservation lights. For a moment, she whispered, almost a prayer, "You carried this kingdom with such grace. I'll try to do the same." And somewhere, beneath the silence, the echoes of the past seemed to answer back, not in words, but in warmth. The robe had become more than fabric. It was now a symbol of continuity, forgiveness, and memory, the weight of history shared between two queens who would forever be linked by more than a crown. The following week, the palace corridors buzzed with speculation, not the kind the press could hear, but the quiet hum of curiosity among those who had served the royal family for decades. Everyone wanted to know, how did the late Queen's coronation robe, sealed, archived, and catalogued years ago, find its way into Camilla's private wardrobe? For the public, the question would have been dismissed as rumor. But for those inside the palace walls, it was no small matter. Everything that belonged to the late Queen was tracked with near-sacred precision. Nothing went missing without reason. King Charles had quietly ordered a discreet internal review, handled by the Royal Custodian's Office, a small, specialized branch responsible for the safekeeping of royal artifacts. At the center of this investigation was one man, Sir Alistair Grange, a longtime royal archivist, known for his meticulous loyalty and his near-photographic memory of palace inventories. He was summoned to Clarion's house one misty morning, his brown leather ledger tucked under his arm. When he entered the room, Camilla and Charles were both present, seated informally by the window. The robe lay nearby, now carefully enclosed in a glass preservation case. "Sir Alistair," Charles began, his tone calm but deliberate. "You've overseen the Royal Textile Archives for how many years now?" 32, Your Majesty, the man replied. "Since Her late Majesty's Silver Jubilee." Charles nodded. "Then you understand why we're puzzled." Alistair's eyes softened as they turned toward the robe. For a long moment, he simply looked at it, his expression unreadable. Then, quietly, he said, "I do, sir. But perhaps not all mystery should alarm us." Camilla tilted her head. "You know something, don't you?" A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Not something. Someone." The room fell silent. He opened his old ledger, its pages yellowed from years of service. "When the Queen passed, each royal artifact was transferred to Windsor's secure archive under my supervision," he began. "But there was one exception, a personal request, unsigned but clear in instruction. It was addressed only to the keeper." "The keeper?" Camilla asked softly. "Yes," he said. "It was a private term Her late Majesty used for me. I never spoke of it publicly. It meant I was to safeguard not just her possessions, but her intentions." He turned another page, revealing a small envelope taped between the entries. The seal bore the late Queen's insignia, E2R, pressed into red wax. "I've kept this since the year before she passed," he said, handing it gently to the king. Her final handwritten instruction regarding an item of personal heritage, to be relocated only upon her discretion. Charles broke the seal slowly. The note inside was short, no longer than a few sentences. Written in her unmistakable handwriting, it read, "In time, the garment of my coronation should rest where understanding outweighs judgment. History must breathe beside grace. Elizabeth R." Camilla read it twice before speaking. "She meant my wardrobe," she whispered, realization dawning. "She wanted it, hey?" So Alistair nodded. "Indeed. The robe was not misplaced. It was entrusted to you." For a long moment, there was only the soft ticking of the clock. Even the king seemed lost in thought. Charles finally broke the silence. "She knew what the world would say of us," he murmured. "But she still chose to leave this." He gestured toward the robe. "In your care." Camilla's voice trembled. "She didn't just leave a robe, Charles. She left her trust." The king looked at her with a quiet pride that words couldn't capture. "Mother understood forgiveness in a way few could," he said softly, "and she wanted the symbol of her reign to be preserved not in stone or vaults, but in the heart of the one who now carries her crown." So Alistair closed his ledger gently. "Her late Majesty once told me, legacies are not protected by locks, but by love. I believe that's what she intended, hey?" Camilla smiled faintly, tears welling in her eyes. "And to think, the world would have never known this was her doing." "Perhaps it wasn't meant to," Alistair said kindly. "Perhaps she wanted this to be a private reconciliation between two women history tried to divide." Those words sank deep. For years, the narrative between Elizabeth and Camilla had been written by outsiders, tabloids, speculators, strangers who knew little of the quiet humanity shared between them. But this act, this silent, deliberate placement of the robe, told a different story. A story of acceptance, grace, and understanding beyond words. Later that afternoon, Sir Alistair escorted the preservation team to Windsor, where he revealed something else, a detail that tied the mystery together even more closely. Inside the royal textile vault, in a section labeled Crown Regalia, miscellaneous, restricted, was a second robe. A perfect replica, made decades ago for ceremonial displays. In the logbook, next to its entry, was a note in Alistair's own hand. Replacement placed by request. Original under personal directive of ER, June 2022. So, the archives had always held the replica, not the real coronation robe. The Queen had orchestrated it herself. Quietly. Intentionally. She planned it all, Alistair whispered. Even down to the swap date. I was only the messenger. When the King and Queen were informed, Charles's eyes glistened with both sorrow and admiration. Typical of her, he said softly. Always one step ahead. Always thinking beyond her lifetime. Camilla looked toward the distant horizon through the palace window. Then she didn't just leave me the robe, she said, her voice breaking slightly. She left me her grace. And for the first time in years, she allowed a tear to fall, not out of grief, but of gratitude. That night, Sir Alistair stood alone in St. George's Chapel, near the resting place of the late Queen. He bowed his head and whispered, "Your message was delivered. Exactly as you wished." The flickering candlelight danced across the marble, and though the chapel was still, he could almost hear her gentle voice, calm, regal, and wise, echoing through the centuries. The robe was never mine alone. It belonged to every hand that carried the crown after me. The keeper smiled faintly. And so it shall. By the next morning, a quiet serenity had returned to Clarence House. The robe remained under glass, but to Camilla, it no longer felt like a burden or ghost from a past. It was a blessing, a message passed through fabric, thread, and time itself. For the first time, she understood. The robe wasn't found by accident. It found her. Spring sunlight streamed across the gardens of Buckingham Palace, touching every leaf and window pane with gold. Weeks had passed since the coronation robe was found, weeks that had quietly changed the mood within the royal family. Something had softened. Even the air inside Clarence House felt lighter, warmer, as though a chapter long left unfinished had finally found its closing line. Behind the scenes, preparations were underway for a private royal exhibition, not a grand public spectacle, but a quiet tribute titled Threads of Service. The idea came from Queen Camilla herself. She wanted to honor the life and reign of Elizabeth II, but also, subtly, to show that history could carry forward, gracefully, truthfully, into new hands. The robe, freshly conserved and carefully restored, would be the centerpiece. When the day arrived, the King and Queen entered the small gallery together. Only a few guests were invited, senior palace staff, family, historians who had served the crown for decades. No cameras, no press, just the gentle murmur of admiration as the robe was revealed behind glass, lit by soft amber light. Gasps echoed quietly across the room. There it stood, the deep scarlet velvet glowing with memory. The gold embroidery shimmered like sunlight on water. Yet now, in the stillness, the robe no longer seemed like a relic of a distant past. It felt alive, breathing, almost radiant with the stories it carried. Camilla stepped closer, her reflection merging with that of the late Queen's portrait that hung just above. For a brief second, their faces aligned. Two queens, two eras, one enduring legacy. "I think she'd approve," Charles said softly beside her. Camilla smiled. "I think she'd tell us to stop fussing and get on with it." Charles chuckled under his breath, that gentle laugh his mother used to love. Then his expression softened again. "She always believed grace wasn't shown in grandeur," he said. "It was shown in restraint." Camilla nodded slowly. "And in forgiveness," she added. "The kind that doesn't need words." Later that evening, as the exhibition closed, Camilla returned alone to the gallery. The others had gone. The lights were dimmed, and only the robe's glass case still glowed faintly. She stood quietly for a long moment. In the stillness, she spoke softly, not to the room, but to the memory that lingered within it. "You were the beginning," she whispered, "and I'll make sure your story never feels like the end." Her hand touched the glass gently. Somewhere deep inside, she felt peace, a rare kind of peace only found when forgiveness finally meets understanding. The next morning, a decision was made. The king and queen would allow the public to view the robe, not as part of a grand museum display, but as a traveling exhibition across the Commonwealth. The robe belonged to every nation she served, Charles said. Let it travel home once more. And so, the journey began. In Ottawa, school children pressed their faces against the glass, whispering, "That's the Queen's robe." In Sydney, an elderly woman wiped away tears and said, "I saw her wear it when I was 6. In Edinburgh, a quiet applause filled the gallery, not for a monarch, but for a memory reborn. Each stop brought new stories, new generations meeting the past, realizing that history wasn't something behind us, but something still walking beside us. And through it all, Camilla watched from afar, sometimes smiling, sometimes reflective, but always humbled by what the robe had become. No longer a secret, no longer a burden, a bridge between two reigns, two women, and one unbroken promise of service. Weeks later, when the robe returned to the United Kingdom, it was taken to Windsor for its final resting place. Not in the vaults, not in a locked archive, but in a sunlit room overlooking the gardens, where visitors could see it freely. The plaque beneath it read simply, "The Coronation Robe of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, preserved by her successor, Queen Camilla, in honor, in grace, in gratitude." When Camilla saw the inscription, she felt something lift, a quiet release of years of judgment, comparison, and misunderstanding. She didn't need the robe to prove her worth. She only needed to carry its meaning forward. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Charles found her standing by the window, watching the fading light over the Thames. "She left it for you, you know," he said gently. Camilla turned. "The robe." He shook his head. "The example." She smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure we don't forget it." Charles nodded, slipping his arm around her. "We won't," he said. "Not as long as love guides the crown." Outside, the bells of Westminster began to toll softly. A new era had already begun, one stitched with memory, mercy, and the quiet dignity of two queens who would forever be bound by the same thread. And so, what began as a simple wardrobe inspection became one of the most touching royal discoveries in recent memory. A single robe, forgotten, hidden, yet never truly lost, found its way home when it was needed most. Perhaps it wasn't just coincidence. Perhaps it was the universe, or the late Queen herself, reminding us that grace is not a crown we wear, but a choice we pass on. Two queens, two hearts, one silent message that outlived them both. And if you look closely at the photos from that quiet Windsor room, you'll notice something curious, a reflection of two figures in the glass. Some say it's just the lighting. Others believe it's something more, a reminder that legacies don't fade. They linger, quietly, eternally, in the places where understanding finally meets forgiveness. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes that history is written not in ink, but in heart. Because sometimes, the most powerful royal stories aren't the ones we're told. They're the ones time chooses to reveal. Crown sparkles,